Hello everyone, intuitive and astrologer Lisa Salvatore here to just give you a little bit more of insights into retrograde planets in your birth chart or your natal chart as it's called technically. I get this question a lot. So I just want to say that when the outer planets are retrograde, which is Neptune, Uranus, Pluto, and also Jupiter and Saturn, which are considered social planets, they sit between the personal and the transpersonal planets, okay? The inner and the outer planets. So it's important to understand that a lot of people actually are born under the outer planets being retrograde, which are, again, Neptune, Pluto, and Uranus, because they span from anywhere between 4 to 6 months retrograde. So it's really not that uncommon to have 1, 2, or more planets retrograde at birth. Now, Uranus, Pluto, and Neptune are generational, so the energy of those planets is going to play out generationally because they spend a significant amount of time in each sign. For a frame of reference, Pluto can spend anywhere from 10 to 20 years in one sign. Pluto has a 248-year orbit, where Uranus spends about 7 years in one sign. Uranus has an 84-year orbit. And then Neptune spends about 14 years in each sign on average, okay? So the outer planets spend a significant amount of time in one zodiac sign, which means that a generation here will be born under that zodiac sign within that planet. However, that planet is going to be individually placed, uniquely placed in your birth chart. So that is where that energy will play out for you. So that is different, and it ties into a story of you, of your unique soul path, of your soul purpose, of your birth chart. So again, to have those 3 planets retrograde in the birth chart is really not that uncommon. Then when we get to Jupiter and Saturn, which are our social planets, Jupiter spends roughly 4 months retrograde, as does Saturn, a little bit longer. Saturn's more like 4.5 months on average. So again, not terribly uncommon to have both Saturn and or Jupiter retrograde in your birth chart. But then when we move to the inner planets, that's where it gets a little bit more meaty on the karmic scale. So let's start with, obviously the sun is not retrograde ever, nor is the moon. Although when the moon goes void, that can be considered like a retrograde of the moon, but that's another topic for another day. So technically it's Venus, Mars, and Mercury. Those are our inner planets. So let's start with Mercury, as Mercury is the closest planet to the sun. Mercury cannot stray that far from the sun, and Mercury will station retrograde 3 times a year, sometimes 4. So again, not as common, but also not as uncommon. Now, when Mercury is retrograde in the birth chart, and again, I'm giving you a very loose explanation. You have to understand that astrology charts are complex, okay? And they're very unique to your soul, to your soul's path, to your soul's journey, okay? So if I were doing a reading for you, no 2 Mercury retrogrades in a birth chart are going to play out the same way, even if they're in the same sign, for example. Again, it's a very unique story. But on a broader scale, generally speaking, if you have Mercury retrograde at birth, here's what it means. Mercury is a planet that rules over our mind, okay? Mercury is all about the way that we think. It's the way that we process information. It's the way that we learn. It's our ability and our capacity to perceive information. It's the way that we communicate, the way that we express ourselves, both verbally and in written form. It's also our coordination and our mental dexterity. So if Mercury is retrograde at birth, it tells a karmic story from the previous lifetime, if you subscribe to that theory, which I obviously do, to the previous lifetime, and then that also carries on into this lifetime where the individual has a little bit more karma surrounding the Mercury areas of life, and in the area, the house of the chart where this falls, is going to tell an even deeper part of that story, okay? Now, I always say with Mercury retrograde, I find that those that have it, it starts off as more of a hindrance to them and for them, almost like a burden. And if they don't really understand astrology, they wouldn't consciously understand it, but they would unconsciously understand it because they would feel it every single day of their life. The burden of their Mercury, of where they might feel inadequate when it comes to communication, when it comes to the expression of the soul, when it comes to public speaking. Again, these are just examples of how it can play out. But there's some karma surrounding the mercurial, the Mercury areas of life. But like I said, to me, Mercury retrograde at birth is a superpower because when Mercury stations retrograde, again, 3 times a year, all of the areas that Mercury rules over become a little bit out of pocket. They become a little bit wonky. They become very frustrating, and we can see a lot of delays when it comes to all of the Mercury areas, which is not only communication and information, but also travel, technology. So there's other things here. But for those that actually have Mercury retrograde at birth, think about it like they're used to that energy. So it's not as challenging for them in some capacity. And again, this is not all across the board. It's going to be different for everybody. But I always say it's like a superpower because those with Mercury retrograde at birth learn to become much more eloquent as time goes on with their way of communication, their style, however it is. They get used to it. It becomes a part of them. They understand themselves at a much deeper level because having Mercury retrograde typically makes an individual more introverted when it comes to their expression. Now, of course, again, I have to just always reiterate, there's a whole chart here that tells a whole story. So it will not be the same for everybody, but I can guarantee that some of this will mimic if you have Mercury retrograde at birth. Again, it tells a deeper, more karmic story. Now, let's move on to Venus, because that's as we start to get further from the sun by planetary placement, the retrogrades, for the inner planets at least, the retrogrades become a little bit more karmically intense. So next stop after Mercury is Venus. So those that have Venus retrograde at birth. Now you have to understand that Venus stations retrograde much more infrequently than Mercury. Venus will only station retrograde once every 18 months for approximately 40 days. Now, Venus rules over love, she rules over money, she rules over pleasure, she's the way that we connect, she's what we like, she's our style, our tastes, our aesthetics, the way we handle romance and attraction, the way we draw others to us or repel them. That's Venus. So when you have Venus retrograde at birth, there's a story here, a very deep karmic story about those areas of life. Again, this is also very personal to the individual. I find that when I work with clients that have Venus retrograde at birth and are unaware of it, when we start to go into that space and we start to unlock that story, it's like their world opens up because they understand themselves on a much deeper level and they don't feel as blocked when it comes to their Venus expression. Again, that's past life driven, okay? But this always has to do with their love life, with their relationship to money, their relationship to love, and more importantly, the relationship to self. Because one of the strongest lessons of Venus retrograde at birth especially is you have to love the self first and foremost to be able to receive love in the way you want to, right? Because you can still receive love, but it might just not work out the way you genuinely want it to. Because if you don't understand your Venus placement, if you don't understand your Venus story, you're not going to be able to have that sweetness that you truly desire. Or you might be able to have it, but you just won't feel fulfilled. So again, very karmic. I actually had a client say to me one time, once we dug into her Venus placement, she said, "Wow, I feel like you just removed a curse from me. I always felt cursed." I said, "No, you weren't cursed. You were just not conscious of this. Now you're conscious, you can work with this energy differently and bring this forward into your relationships now that you understand yourself at a deeper level." And that is the purpose of astrology, right? To bring the unconscious forth to the conscious. So that with that awareness, you can work with your energy differently. You can do things a different way, and you can give yourself some more grace, some more compassion, knowing that none of us are perfect. And we all have our stuff to work through, okay? And then we get to Mars. Now, Mars retrograde only happens once every 2 years, every 26-ish months, okay, give or take. Now, Mars is known as the red hot planet. That is what he was deemed by the ancients. They feared Mars. So the thing about Mars is he's known as the god of war, okay? Mars is not bad. Mars is all about courage, its energy, its force, its vitality. It's our sexuality, it's our aggression, it's our ability to stand up and fight or not. So when Mars is retrograde at birth, okay, and again, remember, I have to just repeat this, it's going to be different for everybody, but I find individuals with Mars retrograde at birth can sometimes be very repressed sexually, or opposite, they're overactive, which can cause some issues for them in their life. They may have a lot of challenges centered around anger, animosity, aggression. A lot of them are sitting on mountainous rage that they've never tapped into by something that happened in childhood, and it's classically brought in from a previous lifetime. Okay? So until they get in touch with what might be blocking them in some capacity or what might be stopping them, or how come every time I try to go take action, it gets thwarted, or how come I feel so angry, or why do I get so aggressive, or why do I have these sexual issues? Plug and play all of the expressions of Mars. That individual has a lot of strong energy to work through when especially it's Mars, because it's Mars, it's pure energy. So Mars retrograde at birth individuals tend to be more frustrated. They get more frustrated, and if they don't understand their chart, they're not going to understand why. They're not going to be able to work with that energy. Of course, then remember, we have 12 zodiac signs. We have 12 houses in a zodiac wheel. We have aspects. There's all these other moving parts. That's why it's kind of hard to give you like a blanket general statement, but I know that a lot of you ask this all the time about what it means when you have retrograde planets at birth. So I hope that that helped you. That's basic. So again, just to recap, Pluto, Neptune, Uranus retrograde at birth, not that big of a deal. Again, it's personal, so if I were to do a reading for you, we would tap into your particular placement. But generally speaking, not uncommon. Saturn and Jupiter, again, not uncommon. It does tell a little deeper story, though, than those outer planets do, because Saturn's all about karma, and Jupiter's all about expansion and our ability to philosophize and be more connected to the world, how we learn out in the world. So those two retrograde are going to tell a deeper story than the outer planets, but not as intense as the inner planets. And then when we get to those inner planets, which are Mercury, Venus, and Mars, and those are retrograde at birth, much more to the karmic story there, okay? Because those are less common. I hope that that was helpful. I hope that that answered some questions that you might have regarding retrograde planets. Let me know if that helped you out or if you have more questions. And again, you can find me right here.